Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Bottle Bills, Benefits and Challenges. I'm Mary Ann Remolador. I'm the Assistant Director of the Northeast Recycling Council, which many of you know as NERC. We are delighted to host today's webinar and have this discussion about bottle bills. It's a topic that has come up a lot over the last year, and this is our way of providing the opportunity for everyone to talk about it. Let's go over some details before we get going on the presentations. Everyone has been put on mute to keep the background noise to a minimum. We welcome your questions in the webinar, and throughout the whole webinar, we'll wait till the end to take the questions, but you'll see you have a box on your screen. It either says chat or questions, and you can post your questions in there, and I will get to them later on. If you don't see the box on your screen, you may see an orange arrow. If you click on that arrow, the box should open up for you. And we want to let you know, because it's such a common question, the webinar will be recorded, and the presentations, and both the presentations and the recording will be posted on NERC's website by tomorrow. Okay, so we have great speakers today, and I want to tell you a little bit about them. Our first speaker is Susan Collins, the president of the Container Recycling Institute. Susan leads CRI's research and works with environmental organizations, activists, and governments around the world to educate on the benefits of packaging recycling. Our second speaker is Chris Nelson, the supervising environmental analyst of the Sustainable Materials Management Program of the Connecticut Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection. The program coordinates the implementation of the state's comprehensive materials management strategy and develops programs and policies that support Connecticut's material management hierarchy. And we did have a third speaker, Sarah Reeves, scheduled for the webinar, but I just within a few minutes ago found out that she will not be able to attend. So I apologize for that change. I also wanted to let you know that Susan Collins has provided a handout, which is a fact sheet about existing and proposed container laws in the Northeast states, and that is in the handouts part of the box on your screen, and you can download that at any point. Okay, now I am going to share the screen with Susan so she can begin her presentation.
Okay, so Mary Ann, can you confirm that you can see my slides?
Yes, I can see it very
wonderful. Well, thank you so much to NERC for hosting this webinar. We're very pleased to be here and always happy to talk about the benefits of bottle bills. So I'll start by covering something that I cover in every single webinar or conference presentation that we participate in, which is to remind all of us what's really at the heart of the biggest pressing problem we have worldwide, which is the threat of climate change, and actually more than a threat, the climate change that we're already starting to experience, and why we recycle. The key reason that we recycle is to reduce the climate change aspects of the provision of goods. We want to use recycled content instead of virgin content so that we can reduce the production of greenhouse gases and reduce the use of energy and reduce the production of toxics. That is the single biggest benefit of recycling. And if we're doing things like downcycling, then we are failing to realize the promise of recycling, which is using recycled content in place of virgin content. So let's always keep that at the forefront of our minds and make sure that all recycled goods go to the highest and best use. So why beverage containers? Well, first of all, they're used on the go, so they're hard to address in our typical residential recycling programs. At least 1/3 of all drinks sold are consumed away from home, and in some cases it approaches 50%. So we think it's 30 to 50%. They also consume large amounts of energy in manufacturing. They contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, which we can avoid by recycling beverage containers rather than manufacturing new ones from virgin materials. And they comprise a significant volume in the waste stream, and it's really growing, and I'll show you that in a few slides. Also, an average of 14% of litter is from beverage containers, as was found in a bunch of different litter studies, and I'll show you some of that information as well. And that's on a per unit basis. So the benefits of container deposit systems are that the incentives produce very high recycling rates, and they produce very clean recycled materials for manufacturing. They also create jobs and new businesses that can't be outsourced overseas, so they have an economic development aspect as well. And they are producer responsibility programs. They shift the end-of-life costs for used beverage containers to the producers instead of having those things paid for by taxpayers and ratepayers. And of course, we already mentioned the litter and the energy savings, et cetera. So we'll go into this in a little more detail. This photo here is from Environmental Defense in Canada, from a public education campaign that they're doing. And they and others have noted that globally, we dump a garbage truck full of plastic into the ocean every minute. It's about 8 tons worldwide of plastic that goes into the ocean every minute. This is what it looks like when we look at litter from the perspective of Ocean Conservancy's International Coastal Cleanup. They count by number of items. So cigarette butts ends up being the winner in terms of number of items. But what we found is that if you convert this number of items into weight, that beverage bottles, plastic beverage bottles, is actually the #1 item littered in terms of the total quantity littered. I've lost my cursor, so I'm looking for that right now in the hopes of advancing to the next slide. There we go. So we have a lot of statistics from different places on how beverage container deposit laws reduce beverage container litter. This is a comparison of 5 states. 4 of them are in blue. Those are the states that don't have deposit laws in place. You can see that they have about twice as much beverage container litter as the 1 state that does have a deposit law, which is Michigan. But Michigan sort of has half of the container deposit law because their law only covers beer and soda and sparkling water. So if they had a more comprehensive law, you would see even less beverage container litter in Michigan, and the results of this graph would be more striking. Worldwide, this has been studied by an organization, CSIRO, which is an organization that does research. It's a quasi-governmental agency in Australia. And they did a very rigorous statistical study of how beverage container deposit laws reduce litter. And they found that beverage container litter was about 40% lower on average in states with container deposit laws. And that, again, is considering the laws that are in place right now, even though some of those are only what I call half of a container deposit law. So again, the results would be even more dramatic if those states had comprehensive laws. So beverage containers are often trivialized when being discussed, but they are not trivial. This slide shows in an artistic way what one person's beverage container consumption looks like every year. Every man, woman, and child in the United States produces more than 820 beverage containers per year from the mixture of wine and milk and soda and juice and water and all the different types of things that we drink and all the different types of containers, whether they're plastic, glass, aluminum, etc. So obviously this is a lot of material, and every person produces this amount of material in the United States. So it deserves good programs that will recycle this material and keep it from being littered. In the United States, we've seen the sales of beverage containers rising and rising year after year, and that's due to both the fact that our population is ever increasing and the fact that on a per capita basis, we're drinking more and more packaged beverages every year. So when you multiply those two things together, the growth rate is higher than you would expect. Meanwhile, the recycling rate has been stagnant, and in the last couple of years, the recycling rate for beverage containers has even been falling. So that means that we are throwing away these resources more and more every year. And it amounts to billions of containers and billions of dollars worth of material that just gets trashed in landfills. PET plastic water bottles are the primary source of beverage container growth. We can see that since 1996, the amount of water bottles sold in the United States has increased by more than 30 times. Not 30%, but more than 30 times. It's just astronomical growth. So now we're going to take a look worldwide, a quick history of the last couple of years of what's been happening around the world as these beverage container deposit programs have existed and have grown in recent years. So in Europe, this slide is a little bit old. We need to add a few more countries to it. We have found that of the 32 countries in the EU, 16 of them have a container deposit law in place, or one has been announced and it will be in place shortly. In Australia, they went from only having one state with a container deposit law 10 years ago to now in the last 10 years, and mostly just in the last couple of years, all of the other states have come on board with the exception of the state of Victoria. So they're growing in leaps and bounds in deposit laws there. Most of Canada is covered with a container deposit law in one form or another. And what we've seen globally is that literally in just the last couple of years, we've seen a doubling of the number of people that are covered by existing deposit laws. So we went from, rounding off, we went from around 300 million people covered by container deposit laws in 2017, and then just this astronomical growth in the past couple of years. So now, by the time these new laws are implemented, they will serve around 600 million people. And with the single-use plastics directive being passed in the European Union, we expect another 282 million people to come on board. So at that point, by about 2025, deposit laws worldwide will have tripled. In the United States, though, we haven't seen so much growth. We're sort of stuck with the same 10 states that we've had since Hawaii passed their law in 2005. Even so, 47% of all the beverage containers recycled in the U.S. in 2017 came from those 10 states. So the collection rate there is so much higher that it's doing almost half of the job of recycling beverage containers in the U.S. We call them the rock stars of recycling because the beverage container recycling rate in those states, or for the containers that actually have a deposit on them, are double or triple what we see elsewhere. And a lot of that is because we're able to capture beverage containers from away from home, which curbside recycling is usually residential and can't do that. And also, this is before factoring in the contamination differences. So if we factored in contamination, the much lower contamination rate with deposit containers would be an even greater eclipsing of the recycling rates of non-deposit containers. States with higher deposit values have higher redemption rates. They're not all uniform across the United States. Most of the states have a 5-cent deposit, but some of the states have a mixture where some of their containers are 5 cents and other containers are either 10 or 15 cents. And Oregon just recently changed to 10 cents. They were showing here with a redemption rate of 73%, but that is on the rise, and we expect it to be more than 80% when the 2018 numbers finally come in. One of our expressions is, if you're not achieving an 80% redemption rate, you're not doing it right, because the median redemption rate for deposit laws around the world is 82%. Here in the United States, we have some of the laws that are sort of suffering from acute neglect, and so they have some of the lowest redemption rates of any programs in the world. And here are a couple of reasons why the 5-cent deposit that we see and in many of the programs here in the United States, that 5 cents has been in place for 30 or 40 years, and it's simply insufficient. All of the programs need to go to at least 10 cents, and in other places around the world, they're talking about 15 to 20 cents. Also, many of the programs here in the United States are not comprehensive programs. Some of them only cover soda and carbonated water. Others have added in still water, and still others have gone more comprehensive and included other non-carbonated drinks and wine and liquor. And obviously the ideal is to be a completely comprehensive law that covers all of the beverage types and has at least a 10-cent deposit. So lately, we've seen a lot of legislative activity. Even though the legislation hasn't passed, we've seen a lot of legislation introduced. So now we're getting more specific into what's happening in the Northeast states. And the 2 states in the Northeast that introduced container deposit laws in 2019 were New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Now, these haven't passed through the legislature, but we've just seen this legislative activity and wanted to point that out. It wasn't the first time for either one of those states. So they've been introducing a new bill to get a new deposit program. They've been doing that several years in a row. Now to talk about the comparison between this and curbside recycling, we have compiled statistics from curbside recycling access over the years. And even though this chart only goes through 2010, the trend line is about the same. We've seen about the same level of access to curbside recycling, but it hasn't helped the beverage container recycling rate improve. As a matter of fact, the beverage container recycling rate is not just stagnant at this point, but it's declining a little bit. So there was a promise that curbside recycling would help improve the beverage container recycling rate, but we have decades of experience and statistics now that show that it didn't help in the way that it was proposed that it would help. Part of the problem, or part of the reason for that, is the way single stream sort of destroys materials in the process of collecting them and processing them. This is a stark contrast here. The photograph on the left is pure bottles from a container deposit law with no contamination. These 2 photographs were taken within moments of each other in the same facility on the same day. You know, turn to your left and you see these pure bottles. Turn to your right, you see a load being unloaded that is material from a material recovery facility that was residential recycling. And the glass is so contaminated that you can't even see the glass. When I first saw that, I thought that was their residual pile. But the person giving me the tour ran his boot through the load, and I could hear the glass that's in there. So to be fair, it shows a lot of paper on top because the paper sort of floats to the top during transportation. Even so, you can clearly see what a challenge it is to clean up the material on the right and get something that can be recycled out of that as glass. Here's another example of what happens with contamination. This is a load at a paper mill after they've screened out all of the contaminants from the paper. And a lot of what they've screened out is aluminum cans. And the reason for that is that aluminum cans, especially if they get flattened during collection, they end up being sorted along with paper, and they end up going to the paper mill. And when that happens, they never get recycled. Even though the resident clearly intended to recycle their aluminum cans, if they go to the wrong facility, and it's a paper mill, they will ultimately go to the landfill. Also, talking about costs of recycling, there are often comparisons made between the cost of recycling through container deposit programs and through curbside recycling, and often that kind of discussion is too narrowly focused on just the material recovery facility portion of the cost and revenue, and it's not a holistic enough discussion. This data that comes from the province of Ontario is holistic. The data here on costs look at all of the cost factors from the point the can or bottle leaves the resident's hand and goes into their blue bin or cart, and all the way through the collection process, all the way through the processing process, and through the process where scrap value is realized for the sale of the material. And when you look at the sum total of those costs, PET bottles are actually the most expensive of these different beverage container types. That's because most of the cost in handling PET bottles is in the collection phase. They're very, very lightweight, and they take up a lot of space on the collection truck. And the collection portion of the cost is the most intense. The largest portion of the cost is in collection. So it is a myth that PET bottles pay for themselves in the course of recycling through curbside recycling. It's simply not true. The amount that comes in through scrap value is nowhere near enough to pay for the full cost of collection and processing. Furthermore, if you look at a comparison of prices from deposit material to curbside material, the deposit material is far more valuable because it is so much cleaner, and it's pure PET plastic that is clean enough to be made into new bottles again. So for PET, deposit material is worth about 40% more than curbside PET. This has been true over a history of many years that we've been looking at these statistics. And similarly, curbside glass often costs $20 a ton to get rid of, whereas deposit glass can be worth $20 a ton after it's collected. I'm not going to go through this whole list in the interest of time, but I will say that these are all of the different cost components that we consider. Again, it's a holistic way of looking at the entire system and evaluating it properly to account for the changes and being able to determine what the economic benefits are from container deposit laws. In these last few slides, I just want to say that these different groups that do recycling of bottles and cans, that is the Aluminum Association, the Association of Plastics Recyclers, and the Glass Packaging Institute, they have all had policies in favor of container deposit laws for more than a decade. And these are some of their policy positions here. Similarly, we are now entering a phase where we are seeing way more in terms of commitments or goals or whatever these different companies want to call them. They have realized that this is a big issue that their consumers care about, and they want to use more recycled content in their bottles. They want to make sure that 100% of their packaging is recyclable. And sometimes they also have goals for actual recyclability. So this is a sampling of some of their goals. But when I look at this chart and I look at what it is that they want to accomplish, I know that they can't do it without having container deposit laws in a majority of the US states. There's just no way to achieve these kind of numbers without that. Indeed, there's some testimony from Nick Brown, who's the head of sustainability for Coca-Cola European Partners. And I'll just highlight a few things here. In 2017, he said you get higher recovery rates and less littering from container deposit laws. And the very last sentence here, he says, there is no reason why in the UK we would not be striving for a scheme that achieves those kinds of outcomes. So that was their unbridled support for a new container deposit law in the UK, which they got their wish. The UK has announced that they're moving forward with a container deposit law, and just in the last couple of days, they had a choice to decide between sort of an abbreviated law versus a comprehensive one, and they chose to go the comprehensive route. I will also, in the interest of time, skip over this slide, just leaving it here to show that they've given it some thought in the UK, and Coca-Cola European Partners has sketched out 11 key principles for a well-designed deposit return scheme. Lastly, I'll say that we have tons more information on our website, and we're very open to receiving queries through our website as well if there's some information that you're looking for that you can't find. Also, you can join us on Facebook and LinkedIn to get regular updates. We also have a free weekly newsletter that you can sign up for on our website. And with that, I will turn it back over to Marianne and say thank you very much, and I look forward to everyone's questions.
Thank you, Susan. And now I'm going to turn the screen over to Chris Nelson. And we do have questions coming in, and I encourage you to continue sending them in, and we will then address those questions at the end of the webinar, at the end of the presentation.
Marianne, can you see mine?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay. All right. So Connecticut's Bio Bill program has been around since 1980. The law that created the program was established or was passed in 1978, and it went into effect on January 1st, 1980. It's interesting, a lot of people now think of the Bio Bill program as a recycling program, which it does help recycle beverage containers, but the primary initial purpose of the program was an anti-litter program. And if you look at where the statutes are that talk about the Bio Bill program, it's located next to other anti-littering statutes in our overall statutory body of legislation. So that was the purpose. I think the Bio Bill still serves that purpose, even though it does help pull out a clean stream of recycling from the beverage containers. There have been minor changes over the years to the Bio Bill program, some minor tweaks to the handling fees, but essentially from 1980 through 2009, it was more or less status quo. In 2009, a couple of big things happened. One was the program was really expanded for the first time to include water containers. That includes regular non-flavored water as well as flavored water, enhanced vitamin waters, pretty much anything that has water on the label to identify what the product is were pulled into that program. Another big change that happened in 2009 was the unclaimed deposits, or the sheets, started going to the state's general fund instead of remaining with the distributors where they had been since the program had begun. So that kind of changed the dynamics of our program as well. So kind of looking at now and then elements of the Connecticut Bio Bill program from when it was created in 1980 to where we currently are, the deposit's the same. Susan mentioned that. I plugged in the 5 cents in 1980 into an inflation calculator, and it looks like the equivalent amount of a deposit these days would be 16 cents. You know, as we've seen, and Susan mentioned, and we'll show on a subsequent slide, 5 cents isn't quite the motivator it used to be for getting people to redeem containers. So that's why an increase to 10 or even more cents might make sense to put put it more on par where the original deposit was originally set. Connecticut's program, in a nutshell, covers beer and other malt beverages, carbonated soft drinks, including carbonated mineral water. And again, in 2009, it was expanded to include the various waters as well. Container types would be plastic, metal, and glass, bottles and cans. There was along the way containers over 3 liters containing non-carbonated beverages, which would be water, were excluded, and also HDPE containers were excluded. I think there was some concern that you wouldn't be able to separate the PET from HDPE, so that's why they excluded the HDPE, and my understanding is that there are not a lot of beverages coming in the HDPE containers. The handling fee originally started out as 1 cent for all containers. Along the way, I think it was in 1996 where things got adjusted to where they currently stand, where beer containers are a handling fee of 1.5 cents, and all other beverages are 2 cents. This is the handling fee that gets paid to the point where the bottles are redeemed. So whether it's a grocery store or any other place that's selling a deposit container, the people who are doing the redemption there get paid these handling fees to kind of cover their time and effort for being part of the program. In Connecticut, there are really two options for redeeming containers. There would be the retail stores that sell the products, and also some redemption centers in the state where they just exist to take in deposit materials and pay back the deposit. In the beginning of the program in 1980, all the unredeemed deposits were retained by the distributor or the bottler. And then beginning in 2009, those started going to the state. Some other details about the Connecticut program. As Susan mentioned, Connecticut does have a lower redemption rate. It's been dropping a little bit over the years, and it's been hovering around 50% for the most recent few years. The retail stores are only required to take back the brands that they carry. So if you're a specialty store, let's say, we have in Northeast Stop and Shops. If you are selling your own Stop and Shop brand of soda, no other grocery store has to take that back. A redemption center might, but another store doesn't have to take back what they don't carry. We do have a carve out for manufacturers who sell 250,000 or fewer containers in a year of non-carbonated beverages, which is mainly water. So this would be private label water. People are just slapping a label on a water bottle for, maybe a private entity or a specific occasion. But that's a pretty high number to allow a carve out 250,000 or less in a calendar year. And we do get a handful of exemption applications annually. One thing we've noticed in Connecticut is that the number of redemption centers has been dropping over the years. Mainly this is due to the fact that the handling fee has not been increased at all, and the redemption centers are finding that they're having trouble covering their cost of operation based on the handling fees that are long overdue for an upgrade. And one of the other notable aspects is that we occasionally hear reports of cross-border fraud. This would mainly happen, I guess, from my understanding, along our border with Rhode Island, because you'll have distributors who are selling containers into Rhode Island that have the Connecticut bottle deposit label on it, but the deposit is not being charged, so people will accumulate bottles in Rhode Island, drive them across the border to a nearby grocery store in Connecticut, and try to redeem them. So to the extent that there's cross-border fraud going on, it seems to be along the border with Rhode Island. This takes a look at our redemption rate over the years. We don't have any data from before 2009 because that's when the deposit info started being collected by our Department of Revenue Services. So before then, when the distributors were keeping all these sheets, nothing was really being reported to the state, and we don't really know how many containers were being sold and how many were being redeemed. That information was being captured, started in 2009. But some interesting trends if you look at this. The individual red dots are the quarterly redemption rates. You can see they've fluctuated a little bit over time. The red line is a rolling 4-quarter redemption rate, so that shows kind of on an annual basis, updated every quarter, where the redemption rate is. And from about 2016 to the present day, on average, is probably around 50%. And then the blue line on top just shows the number of containers sold per quarter, and the green line is number of containers redeemed. Interesting just to look at, and logically it makes sense that year after year after year basis, more containers being sold in the second and third quarters, which is the summertime. So I guess that's probably when more people are buying beverages to drink out and about, and you see that trend. So since I've been involved with solid waste and recycling issues in Connecticut, I think there have been legislative proposals to revise the bottle bill every single year, and my understanding is it's actually gone on, even before that as well. Some of the things that seem to come up time after time are proposals to increase the deposit from 5 cents to 10 cents, expand to include sports drinks and juices, expand to include wine and spirits, including the nips or miniature bottles, increase the handling fee to be more on par with other bottle bill states. There have been suggestions that some of the sheets that the state's taking and putting to the general fund should be reinvested into the system and helping to create a more modern and robust system of redemption centers. And then, of course, have been proposals to get rid of the bottle bill program, and they argue that the curbside single stream programs can do the job. For the reasons that Susan previously mentioned, I say we disagree with that, but nonetheless, when we get proposals to modernize the bill, there's always proposals, or I'd say counter proposals, to just do away with it overall. So one of the arguments, or the arguments that we see opposing expansion, as you would expect, the manufacturers and distributors of products that might potentially get pulled into the bottle bill program don't want to see their products get pulled in, so they'll obviously lobby against it. The recycling facilities are kind of split on it. On one hand, they'd love to see more glass taken in through the bottle bill program because they want to get glass out of their processing system, but they fight any proposal that would take plastic and or aluminum containers away from them because they say that will in turn increase the tipping fees that they have to charge for mixed recyclables to their customers because they're going to lose money on the sale of commodities. And while I think this is probably true to some extent under the current paradigm, that wouldn't be an issue under a packaging extended producer responsibility scenario under which the MRFs are paid solely to process mixed recyclables. And I'll cover that a little bit more on a future slide. So one of the questions that came up when we were talking about what we would cover in this webinar was how Connecticut as a bottle bill state might integrate the program in with a packaging EPR program if we were ever to go that way. Connecticut, per our comprehensive materials management strategy, highlights extended producer responsibility or EPR programs to help us achieve our goal of 60% diversion by 2024. We have many EPR programs in place for things like mattresses and paint, electronics, and we have been exploring packaging EPR over the past few years as a way to increase and improve recycling and reduce costs to municipalities and residents for recycling services. So a question that gets posed time and time again is if packaging EPR is adopted in Connecticut, how would this impact the existing bottle bill program? Would it go away? My short answer would be no. Details, of course, would need to be worked out, but it's likely that the bottle bill in some form would continue on in parallel with a packaging EPR program that focuses on the collection of packaging materials and or mixed recyclables. You could even have a revamped bottle bill program that might still be the best way to collect glass, metal, and plastic beverage containers, and perhaps you expand that program to take in additional glass containers, which benefits getting the glass out and getting it reused, and it benefits the MRFs as well because they get some of the glass out of their system where the glass becomes a contaminant for the other bales that they're trying to put together. And as I previously mentioned, MRFs operating under a packaging EPR system wouldn't have the same fiscal concerns about losing in plastic and metal containers due to an expanded bottle bill program because, again, they would be paid only at that point under that scenario for processing what they take in into commodities. So part of their overall economic picture then doesn't take into account like, well, what am I going to get when I sell these things? And they're a little bit more immune to the fluctuations of the recycling commodity markets. Additional reasons that the bottle bill is likely to remain in Connecticut. As Susan pointed out, the deposits on beverage containers incentivize proper recycling of the containers, and they reduce the number of containers that might otherwise end up in the trash or discarded as litter. Materials collected through the bottle bill programs, especially glass, have far more value and will likely be more likely will be recycled. And one of the big things in Connecticut is that currently there's about $35 million a year going into the state's general fund from unclaimed deposits. And in a state where we've been facing some fiscal challenges over the years, that $35 million is not something that's going to be given away quickly by the legislators who would have to undo the system. I want to talk about some of the other, I didn't put these on slides, but some of the other benefits and challenges kind of related to the legislative proposals that have been put out over the years. And just with the program in general, some of the things that we've been dealing with on the bottle bill program, and these are, I guess, challenges that we're still trying to deal with, is in no particular order, internet sales. Now that more and more people are purchasing cases of water from Amazon and other places, how do we make sure that those people are initiating a deposit as they should be? I think right now, if I were to order a case of water on Amazon, I may not pay the deposit. I don't know that for sure, but it's something I think that we flagged as an issue that we need to look into. We have heard, we've seen data showing that there are containers of beverages being sold in Connecticut for which, deposits likely are not being initiated. So we don't have a full magnitude of how many, but it's something where I think research would need to be done. And because in Connecticut DEP and Connecticut Department of Revenue Services both have some oversight of the program, we would need to coordinate between agencies to determine who would be doing that investigation. When talks about expanding the bottle bill come up, some of the areas, for example, wine and spirits, they ask, well, will we get the unclaimed deposits for a few years to help develop the necessary infrastructure? Because they'll have to change the delivery trucks. They may have to potentially build sorting facilities. So for the beer and soda industries, when they first got pulled into the program and they got the sheets for all the years of the unclaimed deposits, they were able to invest that money into the system, develop some sorting centers. They got delivery trucks where they could have new product on one side and then the empty bottles on the other side. So there would be some investment needed by new, I'll call them sectors, pulled into the bottle bill. I think we would need to deal with that and maybe find out a way of getting them some of the unclaimed deposits maybe for a few years to allow them to build the infrastructure necessary to allow them to participate in the system. I think regardless of where you are, I think we always have the challenge of how to better capture containers in public spaces. At home, I think people, if they have deposit materials, some places will bring them home or bring them to the store and redeem them. Or if they can't be bothered because the 5 cents is not a big motivator for them, they'll maybe put it in their blue curbside bin. But in public spaces, and I think anywhere you go, you look, and constantly the trash containers are filled with empty Gatorade bottles or water bottles. And I know I spend a lot of my spring and summer afternoons on youth baseball fields, and I'm always a little bit dismayed by the number of empty beverage containers I see, deposit containers, in the trash. And I will actually go through, if there's a recycling container there, and pull some of them out sometimes. But, whether it's public education or just making the infrastructure available, we've got to do better on better capturing beverage containers in these public spaces. Lastly, for me, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but these are resources if people want to refer back to the presentation in a future time. I'm providing some links to Connecticut Bottle Bill Program, both on our website and the bottlebill.org website. And then we have on the some links to the Connecticut Bottle Bill laws and regulations. And lastly, Edith Pastana is actually our main point of contact at Connecticut DEP for the Bottle Bill Program, and she will respond to any questions about compliance with the program. My group will track how the program is doing just to see how much material is coming through it, but at the end of the day, kind of everything flows through Edith from an official standpoint. And that's it for me, Marianne.
All right, thank you, Chris. Okay, we're going to move on to the questions, and quite a few have come in. I'm going to start just at the top. So the first grouping is definitely focused for Susan's presentation. Susan, could you clarify the calculation on rising container production with stable or flat container recycling volume? And it's a two-parter, does your analysis include the tonnages that are redeemed by MRFs around the country?
Okay, great. Yeah. So that's actually our signature project, where we track all of the containers produced, or generated is the word we use, and the containers that get recycled. And the trends are going in the direction that they are due to several factors. So yes, more and more containers are being produced because we have increasing population and per capita consumption is also increasing at the same time. However, a lot of those increases in production are happening in the container types and the deposit status types that are not on deposit. So remember that I said in my presentation that some of the states have half of a container deposit law. They might only cover soda and water soda and beer and sparkling water, have those on deposit. Well, those things on deposit have a recycling rate that's 2 to 3 times higher than non-deposit materials. And it's the non-deposit materials that are growing the fastest. Water is the fastest growing category, and water isn't covered in the deposit laws in several of the states. And the other part of the question was, are we also including materials that go through MRFs? Yes, absolutely. We use a mass balance approach to make sure that we've got everything covered in our recycling rate nationally, so that we can divvy it up appropriately to all the different states and divvy it up in terms of containers on deposit and not on deposit. So it absolutely includes everything, and it's not just material recovery facility, but if you think about places that don't have a deposit law, there will often be scrap yards that take in aluminum cans for recycling. And you might have noticed in the slides that aluminum cans tend to have a high recycling rate, whether they have a deposit or not. And it's because that scrap value sort of acts like a very weak deposit program. So all of that information is included in those statistics.
So within those statistics, do you differentiate between those containers from single stream and dual stream systems?
No, I would say the data on single stream versus dual stream is much weaker. In other words, we've tried to quantify that, and it's really hard because states generally don't keep that kind of data.
Okay. Also, there are several questions around the costs of implementing a bottle bill program. So this question could go to Chris or Susan, wanting to know, are the administrative costs of a deposit system factored into the value of deposit scrap versus curbside collected scrap? Susan, you want to start?
For the statistics we use, no, scrap is isolated as a single item. The administrative cost would go on the cost side of it. So scrap would be a revenue line item, and administrative costs of either type of program are included in the cost of that program. Curbside recycling has plenty of administration as well, in terms of it's not just the trucks on the road, but the trucks have supervisors, and curbside programs have billing systems, and municipalities have recycling coordinators. All of those things would be considered in the part of the cost structure of running a curbside recycling program.
And do either of you know if the National Recycling Coalition has adopted a policy to support beverage container deposit?
I'm really glad that somebody brought up that question. It just recently a policy was adopted in late May of 2019. So just 2 months ago, yes, the National Recycling Coalition did adopt a policy, and I believe there will be an official, announcement made to all of the NRC members coming soon.
Okay. And Susan, you had mentioned Coca-Cola in your presentations. Are there other brands that are getting on board with deposits?
Sure. Well, I want to give plenty of credit to the early movers. Companies like Sierra Nevada and New Belgium have been strongly in favor of container deposit laws for more than a decade. They've had those kind of policy positions, and they've put that information in the sustainability reports that they develop for their companies. But more recently, literally just in the last couple of weeks, a new statement came out of the American Beverage Association that was developed as part of an article, it was in response to a reporter's question from the New York Times. And that article just came out a couple of weeks ago. And that statement was more neutral on container deposit laws than statements we've seen in the past. And Nestle Waters North America just posted a new piece on their website. It's called Nestle Waters North America's Position on U.S. Bottle Deposit Laws. And they talk about reforming some of the existing deposit programs along the lines of many of the things that Chris talked about, calling for some of those same kind of, the updates, the modernization, the reform. They talk about enhancing the effectiveness of existing deposit laws. And while their statement isn't an enthusiastic support of new container deposit laws, it's leaning more in that direction. It's certainly neutral to positive.
Okay. I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about opposition to bottle bills. Susan, you had mentioned that New Jersey and Pennsylvania's bottle bills did not pass, and Chris, you talked about Connecticut's the expansion of the bottle bill not passing this year. And I'd like to ask both of you, and I'd like Chris to start as to what is happening that keeps bottle bills from moving forward?
Well, just based on what I've seen happen at our legislature the past few years, is I think you'll get multiple bottle bill related proposals introduced, and I think the legislators are hearing it from both sides. They keep trying to find some middle ground, and I think at the end of the day, toward the end of the session, it gets really convoluted, and oftentimes the proposals just end up not making it out for a final vote because they've just become too complex. And it seems like the same thing happens, every year. We actually had one of our environmental groups, a couple of them actually, step forward this year and try to facilitate some discussion with all parties prior or right at the start of the session, and try to get issues on the table, try to find common ground. Issues were identified, but at the end of the day, when bills got proposed, and the main bill proposed, I would say was something to make the bottle bill stronger, expand it, that probably was leaning toward what the environmentalists want to see. At the end of the day, the industry kind of rallied and was able to kill that and get it changed into something else. So it's just kind of the same thing happens year after year, where the forces that oppose it, they're able to lobby and essentially get any proposed bills killed.
Susan, can you respond as well?
Yeah, yes, but I don't think I can say it better or add more to what Chris just said. I'll add a little bit here, though, which is that there's a huge disconnect between these very public pronouncements that companies like Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Danone are making, the ones that I showed in one of my slides, where they are sometimes using the word commitment, sometimes using the word goal, that they want to use more recycled content, and yet they have lobbyists in these different states who never for a moment, never is too strong a word, they'll sometimes make overtures toward the use of recycled content, but not lobby in favor of really strong laws that would bring them the recycled content that they say they need. That's where I'm saying there's a disconnect. So what happens behind closed doors or even in the legislature is it's nowhere near as visible as the public statements that are made in favor of recycling and more recycled content.
And there's a question about what do you think is the most difficult parts of implementing a bottle bill program? Chris, you want to start for Connecticut based on your experience?
Well, I wasn't here yet when our program was implemented, but certainly when we've talked about expanding, it's some of the challenges I've heard about where the sectors are saying we need to, it's going to cost us to kind of get the infrastructure we need, again, more delivery trucks or other things to kind of allow us to operate under the system. How are we going to pay for that? Do we have to bear all the costs, or do we get some of the unclaimed deposits to help us establish the original infrastructure? So I think that's one of the main challenges to implementing. And even one of the challenges that we've heard with associated with increasing the deposit from 5 to 10 cents, our redemption centers are concerned with that because they essentially have to front that money before they start getting reimbursed by the distributors, which there can be a month or two lag. So they would have to have money up front to pay the deposits back, and then they kind of have to sit on that for a while until they get reimbursed by the distributors. So, that's a challenge too. And I know that we've heard some concern with the redemption centers about an increased deposit because they're wondering how they'll be able to kind of find the money to cover that increased redemption temporarily until kind of the flow of the redemption, the payback comes back to them. So I think if you were starting from scratch, it would be the same concern is, someone's got to front that money in nickel redemptions until you get repaid by the distributors.
Susan, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, sure. I think about the different kinds of projects I worked on over the years, and when I was a consultant, I remember we would help a lot of communities go through a procurement process for a new curbside collection and trash collection process. And we would always say that they needed to have at least 2 years. The first year of going through the procurement process and the RFP and developing a contract and signing a contract. And then they would need ideally to give at least 6 to 9 months, if not a year, to the selected hauler so they have enough time to purchase the trucks and the carts and establish all of the routes and all of that. And I'm saying all this because I think it's an analogous process, and that if most of the people on this call can think of it in those terms, that you want to have sufficient amount of time for planning because all of the infrastructure needs to be purchased or built out. Yes, that's true. And also, Hawaii was very clever when they started their new deposit law. They knew they would need a fund to pay people back their deposits on day one. So they started with a very long lead time by charging only, I think it was 1/4 of a cent. So this really tiny amount over a 2-year period to the beverage distributors in order to get that fund built up slowly. And then the beverage distributors basically got that credited to them in the first year of operation. So they weren't out any extra money, but it allowed it to pour in to build up the fund in the beginning. So that kind of thinking will help anybody establish a new program like this. Plan ahead and make sure you have some really sophisticated planning in place, and have a process where you handle the financial piece of it as well as the operational piece of it by planning ahead.
Okay, another question that was submitted by several people is, and Chris, I know you had talked a little bit about this in your presentation, but people really want a little bit more discussion about the impact to waste management and MRFs if containers are moved out of the MRF material stream and into the bottle bill, and the impact that could have on their finances.
Okay. Is Chris going to start with that?
Or? Yeah, sorry, I was unmuting myself.
Okay.
I mean, I think the logic's there that if, some of the aluminum plastic does go from the MRF where it's currently going to, instead of being redeemed through the bioable program, it does change the economics of that MRF. I mean, the MRF is charging a tipping fee, and they're counting on revenue sales to cover their operating costs plus a profit. I mean, just simply looking at their economics. So if you take away some of the saleable commodity, especially the stuff that maybe fetches a higher price, it changes the dynamic. So, well, what do they do to make up for that? They would have to increase the tipping fees in order to have the same revenue to cover their operating costs and, make a profit. That's why I think we're intrigued by what packaging extended producer responsibility could do, because it changes the paradigm under which a MRF would operate. And, under an EPR program, MRFs are just paid under, depending on how the program is designed. MRF is paid to take in material, process it, and it's the people who own the material, or the packaging producers. They're the ones on the hook for whether, whatever they're fetching for commodity prices. So the MRF's going to make money in this scenario regardless of whether the markets are up and down, because they're paid on a per ton basis for processing the material to a certain specification. We haven't really convinced any of our MRFs that this is a better way yet, but a few of them have listened to the conversation and kind of realized, like, okay, well, maybe this would work for us. And because I know some of them, especially some of our MRFs in Connecticut, that were locked into long-term contracts where they were paying rebates to towns, and then when the market kind of flipped, they were on the hook for, honoring that contract, but they weren't getting the money from the commodity sales to kind of really cover it. So, I think it is something the MRF should take a look at and consider, saying, maybe under this kind of scenario, we don't care then if some of this expanded bottle bill material gets pulled off, because we're going to be made whole anyhow. We don't have to worry about what we're selling, post-sorting.
Okay.
Marianne, did you want me to jump in on that one as well?
If you have something to add, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I did show that one slide that looks at the same type of question, but from a different perspective, as opposed to the MRFs are one player, one type of company in the whole system of recycling and disposal. We've got some studies that look at it from a different perspective, answering the question, how will this affect a municipality? And there's a compendium of studies that an organization called ReLoop has put a fact sheet together. They looked at 20 studies around the world to summarize what each of those studies found about the impact on municipalities from the implementation of a container deposit law. And it's far more holistic. It doesn't just look at one piece of the puzzle, which is the material recovery facility, but it looks at the collection process, how much gets recycled in the current world and how much gets disposed. And of course, the greater percentage gets disposed, like at least 2/3 of beverage containers get disposed without a container deposit law. So it looks at the savings to municipalities from not having to collect the materials in the disposal stream, not having to collect the materials in the recycling stream, how much they save on fees at the material recovery facility in the landfill, and how much they save from not having to collect as much litter, and then what they lose from losing the material revenue. So that more holistic approach in all of these 20 studies around the world has shown that municipalities save far more money than they lose. And I can give anybody who needs it access to that material as well. And MRFs, I think the other thing that Chris might have mentioned is that MRFs have dealt with the downturn in pricing for different commodities in the last 2 years by adjusting the fees that they charge to municipalities. So, as the MRFs costs go up or the revenues go down, that often gets passed back through the chain to the municipalities.
Okay, Chris, there's a question about whether there has been any talk in Connecticut about reallocating those, the funds that are collected from the containers that aren't returned. Could it possibly go towards other programs within the state or like within Connecticut Deep?
That would be great. But unfortunately, we don't have dedicated funds like that generally in the state at this point. We used to have a lot of dedicated funds, and they all got swept to the general fund years ago. So while we would love to see some of the bottle bill money actually maybe diverted from the general fund to recycling specific or sustainable materials management specific objectives, I'm not holding my breath that that's going to happen, but it would be great.
And Susan, have you, are you aware of states where that is happening, where it's going back into the materials management programs?
Yes, you know, you had wanted me to talk on this webinar about recent changes, and one of the recent changes I forgot to mention was that Vermont did make a change in their law to, instead of just having its sheets go straight to the general fund, they dedicated that money toward clean water programs in the state of Vermont. That change just happened in law in the last year, and it has yet to take effect. I think it takes effect in a few months, so that money will start coming into clean water programs. The biggest one that we see, well, I'll also mention another one in the Northeast, is that I think it's $15 million a year, but someone might be able to correct me on that, from the funding in New York goes to recycling funding or environmental programs in New York. So it's dedicated in New York. It's also, there's a portion of it that's dedicated in Michigan to environmental funding. In California, it's a little bit of a different mechanism, but it's exactly the same money. It's the unclaimed deposits. A huge amount gets paid to the curbside programs in the state of California, and it totals $200 million a year. And we just released a paper on that in the last couple of months, and it's up on our website. It's the latest report that we've produced. So it's pretty easy for people to find on our website that documents exactly how the California curbside programs are receiving $200 million a year from the Beverage Container Fund.
Can either of you speak to what barriers there are to raising deposit amounts so that both redemption centers and the states can share in the funds for processing and possibly create more redemption centers?
I'll start in Connecticut. We, you know, I know as we had these conversations during the legislative session, which included some of our elected officials, there were some of the elected officials who kind of realized it would be worth maybe diverting some of the money and reinvesting in the system, you know, making the redemption centers a little bit more viable, maybe upgrading the equipment, changing the system maybe to more closely mirror, I would say, what we view as a modern system like out in Oregon. The proposal didn't get far enough along where they actually started talking dollar amounts of how much would you know, be diverted, but also as we've talked about expansion to include new products, there's been talk like, well, maybe we can peel off some of that money, assuming that, you know, we'll have comparable levels of redemption and non-redemption, and dedicate some of that new unclaimed deposit stream to specifically fund the system. So I think the idea has been floated here in Connecticut. We just haven't really gotten far enough along where we've gotten into the specifics of how that would work. But I think it's at least on the table as something that can be discussed.
Okay. There's been a lot of questions about wine and liquor bottles. So we'll start with the basic. Are there states that include wine and liquor bottles in their deposit program?
So yes, they are covered, both wine and liquor in Maine, liquor in Vermont, and I think wine and liquor also in Iowa. I did have a chart on that. So it's in the slides. It's also going to our neighbors to the north. They're both covered in the provinces of Alberta and British Columbia. And they are a rich source of clean glass that is heavier glass bottles. A wine bottle can be a pound, or sometimes it can even be 2 pounds if it's something more like a champagne bottle, as opposed to a glass beer bottle, which is only half a pound. So the amount of glass material that's in some of those, and some of the larger spirits containers as well, would be very desirable for the glass industry to get back to make into new glass bottles again.
Susan, can you talk to how those programs may work? Do they work differently than your average beverage container redemption program?
No, not really. They generally go through the same process. The only difference might be instead of a private company that is a distributor in some of the states, they have a state-controlled liquor board, and they would be the distributor. But in terms of the way they interact with the redemption centers or the retailers, it's pretty much the same.
Okay. And do you know of any states that include NIPS?
Yes, that's another good change that just came through in the last couple of years. Maine added NIPS, those very small liquor bottles, to their program about 1.5 years ago. And the state of Massachusetts has also introduced a bill that didn't pass for the last couple of years to introduce NIPS to their law as well. So there's a lot of interest in Massachusetts, and I believe there was a law introduced in Connecticut as well that also did not pass, but there's definitely interest in getting rid of the NIPS because they are frequently littered.
So we're going to switch gears a little bit and wanted to ask your opinion as to why there are so few states with bottle bills.
Chris, do you want to? Okay, I'll take it. Sure. Well, it's just because of this enormous opposition, really. Over time, there has been a new container deposit law introduced in every state. A lot of times it's introduced by a legislator that doesn't realize that they need an entire campaign around it, that it's not as simple an issue as it looks like from an arm's length distance. It's a more complicated issue that needs dedicated help to explain to everybody and work through all the details. So it does need an actual campaign behind it, but there's just always historically been a tremendous amount of opposition, led mainly by the beverage industry, but often also waste haulers will add to their opposition to the program. And it's a lot of opposition to overcome. It's a lot for the environmental organizations to overcome. Clearly, that is happening now worldwide. The world has woken up to the catastrophe that is plastics in the ocean, and that has generated a tremendous amount of interest. As I said, in Europe, they've passed the Single-Use Plastics Directive. That Single-Use Plastics Directive mandates on every country in the EU that they have a 90% collection rate for plastic bottles. And there's no way those countries are going to get to that kind of a collection rate without new container deposit laws. So there's an interim goal of 77% by 2025, and the 90% collection rate is mandated by 2029. So we will see hundreds of millions of people get that kind of coverage in the European Union. And there are also very strong campaigns going on in Canada. And now with what the companies are saying here in the United States, I see the trend continuing into the United States, and I see the possibility of us getting a lot of new container deposit laws in the United States in the next few years, because it's the only way those companies are going to make their recycled content goals.
Mm-hmm.
Just to kind of build on Susan's, opposition point, and here we have in Connecticut a program that's been in existence for decades, and we have some legislators who are truly champions of the bottle bill program. But even when we're doing things, we're just trying to expand or somehow enhance the existing program. We have champions at the legislative building who will push these things. The forces who oppose it, mainly the industry, are able to get in there and kind of muck it up enough where it just can't get forward. So, we experience opposition in a state where we have an existing program, and you can imagine those same forces are doing whatever they do in states trying to start one up from scratch.
And I wanted to ask both of you, if you had the world at your fingertips or a magic wand, what would be the perfect bottle bill program, do you think? How would it be different than what we're doing today? Which one of you want to go?
Want to talk?
Sure, I'll go first.
What would you like to do?
I'll go first because, I think we've looked at some of the other, we haven't really looked globally too much, but certainly some of the other states, and we have taken a look at Oregon, because I think Oregon is one that's typically looked at as a program that has taken a step forward and modernized more recently. And, trying to figure out how to have a robust system of redemption centers. One of the things we hear from our grocery stores is they don't really like sometimes having the reverse vending machines at the front of their shops. On one hand, it does bring in customers, and they get their handful of nickels and they'll come in and shop, but they have downsides, at least from their perception, as well as they've got to clean the bottle room constantly, make it nice for their customers to come in and redeem stuff. And then, sometimes you have to deal with the people who come in with just bags and bags and bags of redeemables. So the grocery stores are not always a huge fan. By having a more robust network of redemption centers, you can alleviate some of that and direct people to redemption centers, which are specializing in redeeming containers, as opposed to having grocery stores and other points of retail having to deal with takebacks. Certainly, in Connecticut, we'd love to see more glass taken out, just because we know that the glass that comes through the bottle bill program is actually being recycled, where the glass that comes through our single stream processing facilities, a lot of it goes to landfill as alternative daily cover, which really isn't recycling, and we'd like to see more of it actually be made, truly recycled. So those would be some of the elements that I would be looking for to enhance our recycling program, our bottle bill program.
And Chris, just to clarify, when you say you'd like to see more glass taken out, you meant taken out of the single stream collection and added into the bottle bill program, correct?
Correct, yes.
Susan? Sure. So I love the question. If I had a magic wand, what would it all look like? Well, speaking from a U.S. perspective, we would have a national bottle bill so that we could get the maximum coverage, so everyone would have an opportunity for the best type of recycling program. It would have a meaningful deposit of at least 10 cents, perhaps 15, if that wasn't getting us at least to an 80 or 90% redemption rate. It would be operated professionally in a seamless and cost-efficient way. The programs that were developed in a lot of the Northeast states were developed 30, 40, even 50 years ago, and there are some elements of those programs that are just ridiculously clunky because they haven't been streamlined over those last few decades. And we can look to other programs that are newer in the world, or have done what Oregon did, which was rethink the whole thing. And we can build efficiency into it. Embrace technology. There are programs now that use the things that, the technology that people are using their phones, having an electronic account so that it doesn't have to be an exchange of cash, and having the ability to give money to charity if you want, like the programs do in Maine and New York. It would be very consumer friendly. Nobody should be waiting in long lines. It would be absolutely comprehensive, covering all different kinds of beverage container types. It would be coordinated so that they could operate in the most cost-efficient way and also produce annual reporting so that we could check in on the program every 5 years like they do in British Columbia and Alberta and do continuous improvement so that every 5 years there's a new plan for how are we going to make this program better over the next 5 years. There would be rigorous reporting so that we could get the data we need to be able to do that continuous improvement. There would be a consumer awareness program, an education on the program, and consumer surveys getting their feedback on what improvements they'd like to see, and also stakeholder surveys to see what the stakeholders think could be improved about the program. There's some of the Canadian programs like British Columbia and Alberta have such a positive attitude running throughout the structure of their program about continuous improvement and celebrating what works best, that it keeps them moving forward in a positive way, where the counterparts in the United States seem like everybody who's operating in the program sometimes is unhappy because they haven't embraced these new ideas and this efficiency.
Okay, and we have a few more questions that have come in. I'm mindful of the time. We have about 10 minutes left, so I think we're good. Chris, you had mentioned that some bottles and cans with Connecticut deposit labels are sold in Rhode Island, and that this could be a problem. So how can this be remedied? Because in some states that this has actually been a reason why legislators may not support a bottle bill. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think one of the issues is just, being Connecticut a smaller New England state, is you have distributors who have customers in both territories or both states, and they don't necessarily want to carry two different products, one for their Connecticut customers and one for their Rhode Island customers. So I think we actually get probably both things, where you have distributors who are selling containers that are marked for deposit in both Connecticut and Rhode Island, and the deposit, of course, is not being collected in Rhode Island. Or you may have a distributor who's selling product that's not marked, and they're selling it in Rhode Island, which is fine, but things like we occasionally see water bottles sold in Connecticut, which should have a deposit label on them, but are not, because the distributor, got a batch of non-deposit containers. So, ultimately it comes down to having the distributors just having, product for each specific state. And if it's a bottle state, you have to have one batch of product, and if it's a non-bottle state, the other. And if you are a distributor that happens to service both states, you'd have to have both on hand.
Mm-hmm. Susan, did you have any thoughts on this issue as well?
Yeah, throughout the last 15 or 20 years that I've been working on extended producer responsibility systems, a word that comes up a lot is harmonization, which is making things more uniform across different programs in different states. And again, waving a magic wand, it would make a lot more sense to have the program cover all of these states that are bordering each other in New England, at least, if not the entire Northeast. And have them either operating the same or just literally blend it all into one program, so that these issues of going across the state line would just be eliminated. Just make the program all the same in all of the states, and it could even be operated as one program across all the states.
Okay. Well, I think that will do it on the questions. I want to thank Susan and Chris for their presentations and their ideas that they shared in answering all of your questions. We will be posting the presentations and the webinar recording on NERC's website by tomorrow. So that's www.nerc.org. And I wanted to let you know about the next webinar in NERC series. This is will be the second one. It's scheduled for September 11th at 1:30 Eastern Time, and it is about U.S. regulatory approaches for packaging. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and I hope that you will join us on our next webinar, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.